The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured gardens of Windsor Castle as Thomas Miller adjusted his crisp white shirt for what felt like the 100th time. At 24, he had worked as a junior gardener for 3 years, but today was different. Today, he would be working directly in the Queen Consort's private garden section, a privilege usually reserved for senior staff, members with decades of experience. Thomas had earned this opportunity through pure dedication. While other workers took their lunch breaks, he stayed behind to perfect the rose arrangements. When storms damaged the flower beds, he volunteered to work overtime without pay. His supervisor, Mr. Henderson, had finally noticed his commitment and recommended him for this special assignment. The private garden was a masterpiece of careful planning and artistic vision. Every flower had been chosen for its color, every hedge trimmed to perfection. Thomas felt honored to be trusted with maintaining such beauty. He knew that Queen Camilla personally oversaw many decisions about this space, often walking through in the early mornings to check on her beloved roses. As Thomas began his work, carefully pruning the climbing roses near the main pathway, he noticed movement in his peripheral vision. A figure was approaching along the cobblestone path, flanked by 2 members of the Royal Protection Squad. His heart began to race as he realized it was Queen Camilla herself. Dressed in an elegant cream-colored coat and practical walking shoes, Thomas had been briefed on proper protocol. When a member of the royal family approached, staff members should step back respectfully, avoid direct eye contact unless spoken to, and remain quietly at their posts. He moved slightly to the side, continuing his work while staying alert to any instructions he might receive. Queen Camilla paused near the rose garden, examining the blooms with the practiced eye of someone who genuinely loved gardening. Thomas felt a surge of pride knowing that his careful work over the past weeks had contributed to the garden's current beauty. The roses were in full bloom, their colors vibrant and their arrangement perfectly balanced. What happened next would change everything for Thomas. As Queen Camilla walked closer to examine a particularly stunning display of white roses that Thomas had been nurturing, she accidentally stepped on a garden hose that had been partially hidden under some fallen leaves. The hose created an unexpected obstacle, and she stumbled forward slightly. Thomas's instincts kicked in immediately. Without thinking about protocol or proper procedure, he dropped his pruning shears and stepped forward quickly to steady the Queen Consort. His hands briefly touched her arm to prevent her from falling into the thorny rosebush ahead of her. For a moment, everything seemed frozen in time. Queen Camilla regained her balance. The protection officers tensed visibly, and Thomas realized what he had just done. He had touched a member of the royal family without permission, breaking one of the most fundamental rules of royal protocol. The silence stretched uncomfortably as Queen Camilla straightened her coat and looked directly at Thomas. Her expression was unreadable, a mixture of surprise and something else that Thomas couldn't identify. The protection officers moved slightly closer, their hands instinctively moving toward their radios. Thomas immediately stepped back and began to stammer an apology. His face flushed red as he realized the gravity of his actions. He had only meant to help, but he understood that good intentions didn't excuse breaking established protocols that existed for important security and cultural reasons. Queen Camilla's response was swift and unexpected. Instead of acknowledging his attempt to help or even simply walking away, she drew herself up to her full height and spoke in a voice cold enough to freeze the morning air. Her words were sharp and cutting, expressing her displeasure at what she saw as an inappropriate breach of respect and boundaries. But what came next shocked everyone present, including the experienced protection officers who had seen many unusual situations during their careers. In a moment that seemed to come from nowhere, Queen Camilla leaned forward slightly and spat directly at Thomas's feet. The action deliberate and unmistakable. The gesture was so unexpected, so completely outside the realm of normal royal behavior, that for several seconds nobody moved or spoke. Thomas stood frozen, staring down at the ground near his work boots, unable to process what had just happened. The protection officers exchanged glances, clearly as surprised as Thomas by this unprecedented breach of royal dignity. The morning air, seemed to grow heavier as the implications of what had just occurred began to sink in. Thomas felt his cheeks burning with humiliation and confusion. He had tried to help prevent an accident, and somehow this had led to one of the most degrading experiences of his life. Queen Camilla turned sharply and began walking away, her heels clicking against the stone pathway with quick, angry steps. The protection officers remained for a moment, looking at Thomas with expressions that mixed professional concern with personal sympathy. One of them, a tall man with graying temples, gave Thomas a slight nod that seemed to convey understanding before following their charge. Thomas stood alone in the garden he had worked so hard to perfect, surrounded by the beautiful roses that now seemed to mock his situation. The tools scattered around his feet reminded him of how quickly everything had changed from a normal morning to something he could never have imagined. As he slowly began to collect his pruning shears and organize his thoughts, Thomas had no idea that this moment would set in motion a series of events that would challenge everything he thought he knew about justice, loyalty, and the true meaning of honor within the walls of the ancient castle. Word of the incident spread through the castle staff like wildfire, though the details became more distorted with each telling. By lunchtime, the story had transformed from a simple breach of protocol into wild tales of confrontation and disrespect. Thomas found himself at the center of whispered conversations and pointed stares as he tried to continue his work. Margaret Foster, the head housekeeper with 30 years of service, was among the first to hear an accurate account of what had happened. She had been arranging flowers in the main hall when she overheard two protection officers discussing the morning's events in hushed, serious tones. What she heard made her stop her work completely. Margaret had known Thomas since his first day at the castle. She had watched him grow from a nervous young man who could barely tie his work boots properly into a dedicated employee who took genuine pride in his responsibilities. The idea that he would intentionally disrespect any member of the royal family seemed impossible to her. More importantly, Margaret had also observed Queen Camilla's behavior over the years. While she respected her position, she had noticed instances of sharp temper and unreasonable demands that seemed inconsistent with the dignity expected of the royal family. She had once witnessed the queen consort berating a young maid to tears over a minor mistake with table settings. As Margaret continued her duties throughout the day, she made mental notes of other staff members' reactions to the news. She noticed that the more experienced employees, those who had worked at the castle for many years, seemed troubled by the accounts they were hearing. Their expressions suggested they found something disturbing about the situation, though none spoke openly about their concerns. Captain James Morrison had served in the Royal Protection Squad for 15 years. He had protected multiple members of the royal family through countless public appearances, private events, and personal moments. In all his experience, he had never witnessed behavior like what he had seen that morning in the garden. Morrison prided himself on his professionalism and discretion. He understood that his role required absolute loyalty and confidentiality. However, what he had observed troubled him deeply. Not just as a protection officer, but as a man who believed in basic human dignity and respect, the young gardener's actions had been clearly motivated by genuine concern for the queen consort's safety. Morrison had seen the sequence of events unfold and recognized immediately that Thomas had acted on instinct to prevent a potentially serious fall. The response from Queen Camilla had been so disproportionate and inappropriate that Morrison found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about the person he was sworn to protect. That evening, Morrison requested a private meeting with his superior, Commander Sarah Walsh. Walsh had been with the Royal Protection Squad for over 20 years and was known for her unwavering integrity and sound judgment. Morrison knew that if anyone could provide guidance on this unprecedented situation, it would be her. The meeting took place in Walsh's office, a small but efficient space lined with commendations and photographs from years of distinguished service. Morrison chose his words carefully as he recounted the morning's events. Sticking strictly to facts and avoiding any personal opinions or judgments, Commander Walsh listened intently, asking occasional questions for clarification. Her expression remained neutral throughout Morrison's account, but he could see the concern growing in her eyes. When he finished speaking, she was quiet for a long moment, clearly considering the implications of what she had heard. Walsh explained that while they were bound by strict protocols regarding confidentiality, there were also guidelines about reporting concerning behavior, even when it involved members of the royal family. She emphasized that their primary duty was protecting the monarchy as an institution, which sometimes required difficult decisions about individual actions that might damage that institution's reputation. Meanwhile, Thomas struggled to process what had happened to him. He completed his assigned tasks mechanically, but his usual enthusiasm for the work had vanished. Every time he passed other staff members, he wondered what they had heard and what they thought of him. The shame and confusion from the morning's incident seemed to follow him like a shadow during his lunch break. Thomas sat alone in the staff break room, barely touching the sandwich he had brought from home. His supervisor, Mr. Henderson, approached and sat down across from him. Henderson was a kind man in his 50s who had always treated Thomas fairly and with respect. Henderson spoke quietly, acknowledging that he had heard about the incident but wanted to hear Thomas's version directly. As Thomas recounted what had happened, Henderson listened without interruption, nodding occasionally to show he was paying attention. When Thomas finished, Henderson was quiet for a moment before offering his perspective. Henderson explained that, in his 25 years at the castle, he had learned that sometimes good intentions could lead to complicated situations. He assured Thomas that anyone who knew his character would understand that he had been trying to help, not cause trouble. More importantly, Henderson mentioned that he had already spoken with several long-time staff members who were expressing concern about the situation. The conversation gave Thomas some comfort, but he still felt overwhelmed by the injustice of what had happened. He had dedicated himself to his work, followed all the rules he had been taught, and acted on human instinct to prevent someone from getting hurt. The response had been humiliating and completely disproportionate to his actions. As the afternoon wore on, Thomas noticed that some of the senior staff members were having quiet conversations in small groups. There was an unusual tension in the air, as if something important was building beneath the surface of normal castle operations. He couldn't hear what was being discussed, but the serious expressions and occasional glances in his direction suggested that the morning's incident was having wider implications than he had realized. What Thomas didn't know was that several key figures among the castle staff and security personnel were beginning to see his situation as representative of a larger problem. They were starting to question whether the behavior they had witnessed that morning was acceptable, regardless of the rank and position of the person who had exhibited it. By the following morning, the atmosphere at Windsor Castle had shifted noticeably. Staff members who usually greeted each other with cheerful small talk were having serious, whispered conversations. The incident in the garden had become more than just gossip. It had sparked something deeper among the castle's workforce. Commander Sarah Walsh had spent most of the previous evening reviewing protocols and regulations, searching for precedents that might guide her response to the unprecedented situation. She had also made several discreet phone calls to trusted colleagues, seeking advice without revealing specific details. The consensus was troubling. Behavior like what Morrison had described could not be ignored, regardless of who was involved. Early that morning, Walsh made a decision that would change everything. She called for a meeting with her most senior protection officers, including Morrison and 3 other veterans with impeccable records and years of experience protecting the royal family. The meeting was scheduled for a small conference room away from the main castle operations. When the 5 officers assembled, Walsh addressed them with characteristic directness. She explained that they were facing a situation that challenged their understanding of their duties and responsibilities. While their primary obligation was protecting members of the royal family, they also had a responsibility to uphold the dignity and reputation of the monarchy as an institution. Morrison recounted his observations, once again for the benefit of his colleagues. As he spoke, Walsh watched their faces carefully. She saw the same concern and confusion that Morrison had expressed the day before. These were experienced professionals who had dedicated their careers to royal service. And they were clearly troubled by what they were hearing. Officer David Chun, a 12-year veteran of the protection squad, spoke first after Morrison finished his account. Chun was known for his diplomatic skills and level-headed approach to complex situations. He acknowledged that the incident represented a serious breach of the standards expected from any member of the royal family, regardless of circumstances. Officer Patricia Wells, who had been protecting royal family members for nearly 2 decades, expressed similar concerns. She pointed out that their role was not just about physical protection, but also about maintaining the integrity of the institution they served. Behavior that undermined basic human dignity reflected poorly on the entire monarchy. The discussion continued for over an hour as the officers wrestled with competing loyalties and responsibilities. They all agreed that the young gardener had acted appropriately and with good intentions. They also agreed that the response he received was unacceptable and represented a serious departure from the standards of behavior expected from the royal family. Commander Walsh finally brought the discussion to its crucial point. She explained that they had a responsibility to report concerning behavior to the appropriate authorities within the royal household. This was not about personal opinions or judgments. It was about maintaining standards that protected the monarchy's reputation and ensured fair treatment of all castle staff. Meanwhile, in another part of the castle, Margaret Foster was having her own important conversation with Helen Crawford, the chief of household staff. Crawford was a formidable woman who had managed castle operations for over 15 years and was known for her fierce protection of staff welfare and her unwavering commitment to proper standards. Margaret had requested the private meeting to discuss what she described as a serious incident affecting staff morale and workplace dignity. She recounted what she had learned about the incident in the garden, emphasizing that multiple reliable sources had confirmed the basic facts of what had occurred. Crawford listened with growing concern as Margaret described the humiliating treatment that Thomas had received. Crawford had always maintained that regardless of rank or position, everyone who worked at the castle deserved to be treated with basic respect and dignity. The incident Margaret described violated those fundamental principles. Helen Crawford had her own history with Queen Camilla's behavior. Over the years, she had received numerous complaints from staff members about unreasonable demands, harsh criticism over minor issues, and general disrespect for the people who worked hard to maintain castle operations. She had tried to address these issues through proper channels, but her concerns had often been dismissed or minimized. The incident with Thomas represented something different, however. This was not just about workplace rudeness or unreasonable demands. This was about a complete breakdown of basic human decency and respect. Crawford realized that this situation might finally provide the catalyst needed to address larger problems that had been building for years. Crawford made her own difficult decision that afternoon. She requested a meeting with Sir Edward Hartwell, the private secretary to the king who oversaw many aspects of royal household operations. Hartwell was known as a fair and thoughtful administrator who took staff concerns seriously and had the king's ear on important matters. The meeting was scheduled for the following day, giving Crawford time to prepare her presentation carefully. She knew that she would need to present facts clearly and professionally, avoiding any appearance of personal vendetta or emotional reaction. The stakes were too high for anything less than perfect professionalism. Thomas, meanwhile, continued his work but found it increasingly difficult to concentrate. He had noticed the unusual number of serious conversations taking place among senior staff members, and he suspected they were related to his situation. While some colleagues offered quiet words of support, others seemed to avoid him entirely, probably worried about becoming involved in whatever controversy was developing that evening. As Thomas prepared to leave the castle, Mr. Henderson approached him with unexpected news. Henderson explained that several senior staff members and protection officers were taking his situation very seriously. They believed that what had happened to him was wrong and were working through proper channels to address the Situation. Henderson was careful not to make any promises about outcomes. But he wanted Thomas to know that he was not alone and that people who mattered were fighting for him. He also advised Thomas to document everything he could remember about the incident, including exact times, locations, and any witnesses who might have observed what happened. For the first time since the incident, Thomas felt a glimmer of hope. He had begun to wonder if he would simply have to accept the humiliation and injustice of what had happened. Learning that respected members of the castle community were willing to stand up for him gave him strength to face whatever might come next. As night fell over Windsor Castle, multiple conversations were taking place that would soon converge into something larger than anyone had initially anticipated. The incident in the garden had exposed deeper problems and created an opportunity for change that had been building for years. The meeting between Helen Crawford and Sir Edward Hartwell took place in his elegant office overlooking the castle's east gardens. Hartwell, a distinguished man in his 60s with silver hair and penetrating blue eyes, had served the royal family for over 3 decades. His reputation for fairness and discretion made him one of the most trusted advisors in the royal household. Crawford presented her concerns with the methodical precision that had made her legendary among castle staff. She outlined the incident with Thomas Miller step by step, providing names of witnesses and explaining how the event had affected morale throughout the castle community. She emphasized that this was not an isolated incident but part of a pattern of behavior that had been building for years. Hartwell listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on a leather-bound pad. His expression remained neutral, but Crawford could see that he was taking her concerns seriously. When she finished her presentation, he asked several pointed questions about the reliability of her sources and the accuracy of the timeline she had provided. Most importantly, Hartwell wanted to understand the broader implications of the situation. Crawford explained that multiple senior staff members and protection officers were deeply concerned about what they had witnessed. She emphasized that these were not people prone to gossip or exaggeration, but experienced professionals who understood the gravity of speaking out about such matters. Hartwell revealed that he had already received preliminary reports from Commander Walsh about concerns within the protection squad. The fact that both household staff and security personnel were raising similar issues independently gave the situation significant weight and urgency. He assured Crawford that the matter would receive his immediate and serious attention. Meanwhile, Commander Walsh was implementing her own plan of action. She had documented the protection officer's concerns in a formal report and requested a meeting with the head of Royal Security, Deputy Assistant Commissioner Robert Sterling. Sterling was responsible for coordinating all aspects of royal protection and had direct access to the highest levels of government and royal administration. The meeting with Sterling took place the following morning in a secure conference room at Scotland Yard. Walsh presented her case with military precision, emphasizing that the protection squad's concerns were based on direct observation and professional judgment. She explained that the officers involved were questioning their ability to effectively protect someone whose behavior they found fundamentally at odds with their understanding of their duties. Sterling, a career police officer with extensive experience in protection operations, understood immediately that Walsh was describing a crisis that went beyond simple workplace complaints. When protection officers began questioning their relationship with the person they were assigned to protect, it created serious operational and security concerns that could not be ignored. Sterling asked detailed questions about the specific incident and the officer's assessment of ongoing risks and complications. Walsh explained that while there was no immediate security threat, the breakdown in trust and respect could lead to long-term problems that might compromise their effectiveness in protecting Queen Camilla and maintaining the professional relationships necessary for successful operations. Back at Windsor Castle, Thomas was experiencing an unexpected development. Word of his situation had begun to spread beyond the castle staff to other royal properties and even to some members of the press who specialized in royal affairs. A reporter from a respected newspaper had contacted the castle's press office asking for comment on rumors of an incident involving Queen Camilla and a member of the household staff. The press inquiry sent immediate shockwaves through the royal communications team. Any negative publicity involving Queen Camilla's behavior towards staff could become a major scandal, particularly given the royal family's ongoing efforts to maintain public support and respect. The situation was escalating beyond internal castle politics into something that could affect the monarchy's public image. Sir Edward Hartwell found himself coordinating responses on multiple fronts. He needed to address the legitimate concerns of staff and protection personnel while also managing the potential public relations crisis that was beginning to develop. Most importantly, he needed to brief King Charles on the situation before it developed further. The briefing with King Charles took place in the king's private study, a comfortable room filled with books and personal mementos that reflected his wide range of interests and long experience in public service. Hartwell presented the facts carefully and objectively, emphasizing that multiple reliable sources had confirmed the basic details of the incident. King Charles listened with growing concern as Hartwell explained the situation. The king had always prided himself on maintaining good relationships with household staff and had often spoken publicly about the importance of treating all people with dignity and respect. The behavior Hartwell was describing was completely inconsistent with the values the king tried to embody and promote. Troubling to the king was the revelation that this appeared to be part of a broader pattern of problematic behavior rather than an isolated incident. Hartwell shared some of the historical concerns that had been raised by staff members over the years, painting a picture of ongoing issues that had never been properly addressed. The king asked Hartwell to arrange a private meeting with Commander Walsh and Deputy Assistant Commissioner Sterling. He wanted to hear directly from the security professionals about their assessment of the situation and its implications for royal protection operations. He also requested a complete review of all staff complaints and concerns related to Queen Camilla's behavior over the previous 2 years. That evening, Queen Camilla herself became aware that her actions in the garden were being discussed at the highest levels of royal administration. A close aide informed her that there had been inquiries from the king's office about recent interactions with household staff. The aide was careful not to reveal specific details, but Queen Camilla understood immediately that the incident with the gardener had somehow escalated far beyond what she had anticipated. Queen Camilla's initial reaction was anger and defensiveness. She felt that a minor incident was being blown out of proportion and that she was being unfairly criticized for maintaining appropriate boundaries with staff members. She began making phone calls to allies within the royal household, seeking support for her position and trying to control the narrative around what had happened. However, as Queen Camilla made more inquiries, she began to realize the seriousness of the situation she was facing. Multiple departments within the royal household were involved in reviewing her conduct, and even her most reliable supporters seemed reluctant to defend her actions in the garden. The isolation she began to feel was unlike anything she had experienced since joining the royal family. The incident that had begun as what Queen Camilla considered a minor assertion of authority was now threatening to become a defining moment in her relationship with the institution she had married into. Forces were aligning against her that she had never anticipated, and the consequences of her actions were about to become much more serious than she had ever imagined. The emergency meeting convened in the king's private conference room at 7 o'clock the following morning. Present were King Charles, Sir Edward Hartwell, Commander Walsh, and Deputy Assistant Commissioner Sterling. The atmosphere was tense as the group gathered around the polished oak table that had hosted countless important discussions throughout the castle's history. King Charles opened the meeting by acknowledging the gravity of the situation and emphasizing his commitment to understanding all aspects of what had occurred. He asked Commander Walsh to present her assessment of the incident and its implications for royal protection operations. Walsh spoke with the calm professionalism that had defined her career, but her words carried unmistakable weight. She explained that the protection officers under her command were experiencing a crisis of confidence in their ability to effectively carry out their duties. The behavior they had witnessed violated their understanding of the values they were sworn to protect and defend. Deputy Assistant Commissioner Sterling supported Walsh's assessment, adding that similar concerns were being raised through other channels within the security services. He emphasized that when protection officers began questioning their relationship with the person they were assigned to protect, it created operational vulnerabilities that could have serious long-term consequences, most damaging to Queen Camilla's position. Was Sterling's revelation that preliminary investigations had uncovered a pattern of concerning behavior spanning several years. Multiple staff members had filed informal complaints through various channels, though most had been reluctant to pursue formal grievances due to concerns about their job security and career prospects. Charles asked specific questions about the timeline of complaints and the nature of the concerns that had been raised. Hartwell presented a summary that painted a troubling picture of escalating incidents involving unreasonable demands, harsh criticism of staff members, and disrespectful treatment of people who were working hard to support royal operations. The meeting was interrupted by an urgent message from the Royal Communications Office. The press inquiry that had begun the previous day had evolved into active investigation by multiple news outlets. Reporters were contacting current and former castle staff members seeking information about Queen Camilla's treatment of household personnel. The communications director, Amanda Richardson, joined the meeting via secure video link to brief the group on the developing media situation. Richardson explained that while no specific details had been published yet, several news organizations were clearly pursuing stories about Queen Camilla's relationship with castle staff. The situation was approaching the point where a coordinated response would be necessary. Charles understood that the monarchy was facing a potential crisis that could damage the institution's reputation and public standing. The royal family had worked for decades to rebuild public trust and respect following various scandals and controversies. A story about Queen Camilla mistreating staff members could undo years of careful relationship building with the British public. More immediately, the king was concerned about the effect the situation was having on castle operations and staff morale. Sir Edward Hartwell reported that productivity was suffering as staff members focused on discussions about the incident rather than their normal duties. More troubling, several longtime employees had privately indicated that they were considering resignation if the matter was not addressed properly. The king made several critical decisions during that morning meeting. First, he authorized a complete investigation into all complaints and concerns related to Queen Camilla's behavior, to be conducted by an independent external consultant with experience in workplace harassment and misconduct issues. Second, he directed that Thomas Miller receive a formal apology and assurance that his job security would not be affected by the incident, or his cooperation with any investigations. Most significantly, the king decided that Queen Camilla would need to be directly confronted about her behavior and its consequences. He instructed Sir Edward Hartwell to arrange a private meeting where the full scope of the concerns would be presented to her, along with clear expectations for changes in her conduct going forward. The confrontation with Queen Camilla took place that same afternoon in her private sitting room. Present were the king, Sir Edward Hartwell, and Commander Walsh. The king had decided that hearing directly from the protection commander would emphasize the seriousness of the operational concerns that had been raised. Queen Camilla's initial response was defensive and angry. She argued that she was being unfairly targeted for maintaining appropriate authority and boundaries with staff members. She suggested that the incident in the garden was being misrepresented and exaggerated by people who had political motivations for undermining her position. However, as the meeting progressed and more details were presented, Queen Camilla began to understand that her position was far more precarious than she had realized. The king's tone remained calm but firm as he explained that the monarchy could not afford to be associated with behavior that violated basic principles of human dignity and respect. Commander Walsh's presentation was particularly impactful. She explained in precise, professional terms how Queen Camilla's actions had compromised the protection officers ability to maintain the respect and professional relationships necessary for effective operations. Walsh emphasized that protecting the monarchy as an institution sometimes required difficult decisions about individual behavior that threatened that institution's integrity. The turning point came when Sir Edward Hartwell presented documentation showing the pattern of complaints and concerns that had accumulated over several years. Faced with concrete evidence of the impact her behavior was having on staff members and operations, Queen Camilla could no longer dismiss the situation as a minor misunderstanding or political attack. King Charles explained that immediate changes would be required in Queen Camilla's interactions with staff members. A formal apology would need to be issued to Thomas Miller, and Queen Camilla would be required to participate in professional development sessions focused on appropriate workplace behavior and respect for all individuals regardless of their position. More significantly, future incidents would result in more serious consequences, potentially including restrictions on Queen Camilla's official duties and public appearances. The king made clear that protecting the monarchy's reputation and maintaining staff morale were non-negotiable priorities that would take precedence over personal preferences or past practices. The meeting concluded with Queen Camilla's reluctant agreement to the requirements that had been outlined. However, her body language and tone suggested that she viewed these measures as unfair punishment, rather than necessary corrections to inappropriate behavior. The king and his advisors understood that ongoing monitoring would be necessary to ensure lasting change. 3 weeks after the confrontation, significant changes were visible throughout Windsor Castle. Thomas Miller had received a formal written apology from Queen Camilla, along with a private meeting where she acknowledged that her behavior had been inappropriate and unacceptable. More importantly, he had been promoted to senior gardener with a substantial salary increase. Recognizing both his dedication and the injustice he had experienced, the promotion announcement was made publicly through the castle's staff newsletter, sending a clear message to all employees that speaking up about mistreatment would be supported rather than punished. Thomas felt vindicated but remained somewhat cautious about his interactions with royal family members, understanding that the dynamics of castle life would take time to fully normalize. Commander Walsh implemented new protocols for protection. Officers dealing with concerning behavior from any member of the royal family. These guidelines clarified that officers had both the authority and responsibility to report conduct that compromised their operational effectiveness or violated basic standards of respect and dignity. The protection squad's morale improved significantly as officers felt more confident about their role and responsibilities. The external investigation commissioned by King Charles revealed a troubling pattern of behavior that extended far beyond the incident in the garden. The independent consultant interviewed over 30 current and former staff members, documenting numerous incidents of inappropriate conduct, unreasonable demands, and disrespectful treatment that had created a hostile work environment for many castle employees. The investigation's findings were presented to King Charles in a confidential report that made sobering reading. The consultant concluded that Queen Camilla's behavior had been systematically damaging staff morale and creating operational inefficiencies that affected the entire royal household's ability to function effectively. More seriously, the pattern of conduct violated employment law and could have exposed the royal household to significant legal liability based on these findings. King Charles implemented comprehensive reforms to castle operations and staff relations. A new position was created for an independent ombudsman, who would handle staff complaints confidentially and ensure that all employees had access to fair grievance procedures. Additionally, mandatory training on respectful workplace behavior was instituted for all members of the royal family and senior staff. Queen Camilla's required professional development sessions began with a private consultation with Dr. Rebecca Martinez, a workplace behavior specialist who had worked with executives and public figures facing similar challenges. Dr. Martinez's approach focused on helping Queen Camilla understand how her actions affected others and developing more effective communication strategies that maintained authority while respecting individual dignity. Initially, Queen Camilla approached these sessions with reluctance and resentment, viewing them as an unfair consequence of what she still considered a minor incident that had been blown out of proportion. However, as the sessions progressed and she began to understand the real impact of her behavior on the people around her, her attitude gradually shifted toward genuine reflection and commitment to change. The broader staff community at Windsor Castle experienced a remarkable transformation in morale and workplace culture. Word spread quickly that complaints about inappropriate behavior would be taken seriously and addressed promptly, creating an environment where employees felt more secure and valued. Productivity improved noticeably as staff members could focus on their duties rather than worrying about avoiding conflict or mistreatment. Margaret Foster, the head housekeeper who had been instrumental in bringing concerns to leadership attention, found herself in an unexpected position of influence and respect. Her willingness to speak up for Thomas and advocate for improved working conditions had established her as a trusted voice for staff concerns, and she was asked to serve on a new committee overseeing workplace culture improvements. The media attention that had initially threatened to become a major scandal was successfully managed through careful communication and transparent acknowledgement of the issues that had been identified. Rather than denying or minimizing the problems, the Royal Communications team emphasized the swift action taken to address concerns and implement meaningful reforms. Several news outlets actually praised the royal household's response to the situation, noting that the willingness to investigate and address staff complaints demonstrated a commitment to modern workplace standards and accountability that enhanced rather than damaged the monarchy's reputation. The story became one of institutional improvement rather than royal scandal. 6 months later, the changes implemented at Windsor Castle had become an established part of daily operations. Staff satisfaction surveys showed dramatic improvements in workplace culture and employee confidence. More importantly, the reforms had created a model that was being implemented across other royal properties and households. Thomas Miller thrived in his new role as senior gardener, taking particular pride in expanding the sustainable gardening practices that Queen Camilla herself had originally championed. Ironically, their shared interest in environmental conservation had become a bridge to a more respectful working relationship. Though both maintained appropriate professional boundaries, Commander Walsh was promoted to Deputy Assistant Commissioner, recognizing her leadership during the crisis and her role in implementing improved security protocols. Her experience managing the situation became a case study in balancing institutional loyalty with accountability, and she was frequently consulted by other protection services facing similar challenges. Queen Camilla gradually rebuilt her relationships with castle staff through consistent demonstration of the respectful behavior she had learned in her professional development sessions. While trust took time to restore fully, staff members began to report more positive interactions and a noticeable improvement in her treatment of employees at all levels. The incident that had begun with a simple attempt to prevent someone from falling had ultimately led to fundamental improvements in how one of Britain's most important institutions operated. Thomas Miller's instinctive act of kindness had exposed deep problems that needed addressing, and his willingness to seek justice had benefited countless other employees who had previously suffered in silence. King Charles reflected privately that while the crisis had been painful and embarrassing for the royal family, it had ultimately strengthened the monarchy by demonstrating its commitment to the values of dignity, respect, and fairness that the British people expected their institutions to embody. The castle gardens where everything began continued to flourish under Thomas's expert care, serving as a daily reminder that positive change often grows from the most unexpected seeds.